Hello, I'm Capucine Morello. I'm head of the pulmonology department at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and I'm going to talk to you today about nocturnal capnography. This presentation will be divided into two parts, the first part dealing with the theoretical basis, and then we will see how to analyze capnography in a practical way. Here are my conflicts of interest in connection with this presentation. I receive a remuneration by Brias. So we will follow the following plan. What are the mechanisms on which transcutaneous capnography is based? Then we will see what the indications are, and finally the limits. So what mechanisms capnography is based on? It's important because it will explain the limits of this examination as well. Today, there are two main capnographers, the TCM5 and the Syntec. Capnography can be done using a sensor positioned here, for example on the earlobe, in spontaneous ventilation, or under non-invasive ventilation. The principle proposed on the sensor that I will detail immediately after, and therefore on the transfer of CO2 through the skin and through the sensor membrane. You can position the sensor in different places, the earlobe that I have already mentioned, and which is the most effective positioning, but also the forehead. It can also be proposed to position it subclavicular, but at that time, only PtCO2 will be recorded, but not the oxygen saturation and heart frequency. So the principle of capnography is based on a heating element, a heating probe, which will cause vasodilation and therefore arterialization of the capillary bed. As CO2 is a highly diffusible gas, it will pass through the skin, then a membrane permeable to CO2 to interact with an electrolyte substance contained in the sensor. The interaction between CO2 and water molecule will produce bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ion. The production of an hydrogen ion will modify the pH, and therefore, thanks to a pH-sensitive electrode, the Severinghaus electrode, we will be able to measure the pH and deduce the PtCO2 by the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. This diffusion of CO2 and the position of the sensor on the skin will be very important for the analysis of the correct CO2. Indeed, you see here an example of a sensor that is badly positioned, which results in a gradual decrease in the PtCO2 to a zero value, which is absolutely not physiological, while we see that there are events that happen during the night with desaturations. So what interests us is not the PtCO2, but the PaCO2. So the first question to ask yourself is there a good correlation between PtCO2 and PaCO2? We can see here in this study, which is now old, that there is a very good correlation between these two measures. Indeed, when we take an arterial blood gas directly from a patient, immediately after the recording of the PtCO2 at the end of the night, we see that the PtCO2 here is measured at the end of the night at 62 mm mercury. We see that the PaCO2 is at 64 mm mercury. Is this true for all devices? I have reviewed the literature on the different devices, and we see that the bias, that is the difference between PaCO2 and PtCO2, is correct but varies between the different devices, but also according to the positioning of the sensor for a given device. Indeed, you can see that here, for example, when using Syntec, the bias is -1 mm of mercury when it is positioned at the level of the ear, and that it is more than 2.4 mm of mercury when it is positioned at the subclavicular level. To measure the quality of the signal, we also look at the limit of approval between PaCO2 and PtCO2. It is said to be clinically acceptable when it is between plus or minus 7.5 mm of mercury, which is the case for all devices. We also see that the difference between PaCO2 and PtCO2 varies depending on the device. That is what we saw on the previous slide. Indeed, we see that this bias of minus 0.75 mm of mercury for Syntec, minus 1.72 mm of mercury for TCM5, and plus 3 mm of mercury for Tosca 500. This means that the Tosca 500 will overestimate the CO2 by 3 mm of mercury, while the TCM5 will underestimate it by about 2 millimeters of mercury, and the Centec will underestimate it by 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury depending on the positioning of the sensor. Like many physiological signals, and especially when using a heating probe, there will be a drift of the signal during the night. You can see that in the first studies in 2007, the drift was more than 1 millimeter of mercury per hour, which means that after a recording of 8 hours, for example, there was 8 millimeters of mercury of drift. There is an improvement in technology, which means that today there is a drift of 0.1 millimeter of mercury per hour, but this is true if the membrane is very recent. Hence the importance of recalibrating the signal at the end of the night. Here you can see the example of a plot where between the raw signal in green and the signal corrected thanks to a new calibration at the end of the night, we will be able to measure the drift of the signal during the night. At the beginning of the night, there is no drift, and then at the end of the night, you see this drift of a few millimeters of mercury. What are the indications for nocturnal transcutaneous capnography? The first indication is the suspicion of nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation, which will indicate the initiation of non-invasive ventilation in patients who have a normal daytime arterial blood gas. This study in patients with restrictive respiratory failure compared the value of daytime PaCO2 in the morning with a value of transcutaneous capnography. And you see that in the general population, there are 20% of patients who have pathological capnography while they have normal daytime blood gas. And this proportion is even higher in neuromuscular patients. Why this difference between PtCO2 and diurnal PaCO2? This is because during the day, when awake, there is a cortical awakening that allows a compensation of diaphragmatic weakness by the extradiaphragmatic muscles, this compensation being no longer possible during sleep, and in particular in REM sleep. Another pathology where we will find a normal blood gas when awakening, whereas as soon as the patient falls asleep, we will find nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation. This is congenital central alveolar hyperventilation syndrome, where, I remind you, these patients have a chemosensitivity and automatic control disorder, which will mean that as soon as they fall asleep, there will no longer be cortical compensation and the appearance of severe alveolar hypoventilation that will not be seen when awake in these patients. It has also been shown in patients with neuromuscular pathologies that the presence of alveolar hypoventilation can predict the risk of initiation of non-invasive ventilation in follow-up. Criteria for nocturnal alveolar ventilation were tested in these patients, and 2 criteria seem to be associated with the need to start non-invasive ventilation during follow-up. You see on a follow-up of a maximum of 5 years with 50% of patients ventilated at 2 years, and these criteria, we will review them. It is a PtCO2 greater than 55 millimeters of mercury for more than 10 minutes, or the increase of a PtCO2 of 10 millimeters of mercury compared to the value at wakefulness with a time spent at a PtCO2 greater than 50 millimeters of mercury of more than 10 minutes. These are the criteria of the American Sleep Society. The second criterion that seemed to predict the need for non-invasive ventilation in follow-up was the presence of a peak greater than 49 millimeters of mercury. It was also shown by the GARCH team, who systematically follow up on their patients with slowly progressive neuromuscular pathologies, polysomnography, capnography and daytime blood gas before the patients are on invasive ventilation, and therefore they looked at the prevalence of sleep disorders, and in particular central and obstructive events in their patient population. This is not the subject that interests us today, but I would point out that 60% of patients have sleep disorders, particularly in the context of Steiner's myotonic dystrophy. You see that there are 25 patients, or 23% of the cohort, who had nocturnal hyperventilation. Without nocturnal hyperventilation, these are the patients in dark blue, here on the graph. And the fact that we don't do nocturnal capnography in these patients exposes a risk of poor management of these patients, with here patients who only had ventilatory polygraphy and arterial blood gas without capnography. you have 25% of patients who were poorly managed, and they in particular did not have NIV when there would be an indication for NIV in these patients. You can see that if we only do a polygraph, 73% of patients are poorly managed with a CPAP instead of a NIV. If we only gas the blood, 65% of patients are poorly treated, including 4 patients who had non-invasive ventilation, but no increase in PEEP to treat obstructive apneas. Nocturnal capnography can also be interesting in the follow-up of patients on NIV. And indeed, in this Norwegian study, Sigurd Retsat evaluated the performance of arterial gases and nocturnal oximetry in detecting alveolar hyperventilation under NIV. These are the current recommendations in patients who had restrictive respiratory failure. And we see that if we look here at the patients who had both capnograph and arterial blood gas and normal nocturnal oximetry, 8% of the patients had nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation detected by a time spent at PtSO2 greater than 6.5 kPa or greater than 50 mm of mercury for more than 10% of the recording time. If we focus only on normal pathological nocturnal oximetry, 30% of patients had nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation, and if we focus only on normal daytime arterial gas, 12% had nocturnal hypoventilation not detected. And therefore nocturnal hyperventilation. Capnography makes it possible to better detect hyperventilation under NIV with a sensitivity of 84% and a specificity of 43%. When we are interested in a patient's body with obesity hypoventilation syndrome, we see that we have only 7 out of 20 patients who have abnormal blood gas, 2 out of 20 patients who have abnormal oximetry. We have 18 out of 20 patients who have nocturnal alveolar hypoventilation, and therefore, while the blood gas is normal, we will be able to detect nocturnal hypoventilation in these patients, thanks to the use of nocturnal capnography. And finally, Marjolaine Georges' team in Dijon compared different NIV monitoring strategies again. Here you can see the different strategies. Either just reading data from the ventilation software, or only nighttime capnography, or a strategy that combines blood gas and night oximetry, nighttime oximetry, and nighttime capnography, or all of these. Daytime arterial blood gas, nighttime oximetry, software data reading, and capnography. And we see that if we combine all these strategies, only 29% of patients are considered to have totally appropriate and effective ventilation. If we remove the capnography, which includes only blood gases and nocturnal oximetry, we do not know 24 patients. And finally, there are 27 patients who had nocturnal hypoventilation, with 6 patients who had normal daytime blood gas and 12 patients who had normal nocturnal oximetry. The last indication for nocturnal capnography is the search for alveolar hyperventilation under NIV, which can be suspected in the presence of central apnea. Here, you see that there was alveolar hyperventilation that preceded the desaturation due to central apnea, and that nocturnal oximetry will not be able to detect, nor will the daytime arterial blood gas. Finally, if we summarize, nocturnal capnography is indicated to indicate non-invasive ventilation at home, or to monitor this non-invasive ventilation in the face of the clinical suspicion of nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation when nocturnal oximetry is not interpretable due to a peripheral capillary oxygen saturation greater than 96%. And therefore the patient is on the flat curve of hemoglobin dissociation, and therefore we will not be able to see significant desaturation, while the PCO2 will have risen with a PO2 that will have decreased, or of course if the patient is on oxygen therapy concomitantly, and which explains that the saturation will be too much, or there is a pathological nocturnal oximetry. But for other causes, with a disorder of the ventilation-perfusion ratio that is found in obese patients, with an obesity syndrome for ventilation in COPD, or in case of atelectasis, where there will be desaturations, we won't be able to know if it's related to nocturnal hypoventilation or desaturation. Finally, there's an error here. In case of clinical suspicion of nocturnal hyperventilation in the presence of central apnea, How will nocturnal capnography be interpreted, and how will we be able to make the diagnosis of nocturnal hypoventilation, and thus what threshold should be used? I have already shown you this study, which had been carried out in patients with neuromuscular pathologies progressively, or 3 thresholds had been tested. American Sleep Society thresholds with a PtCO2 greater than 55 mm of mercury for 10 minutes, or an increase in PtCO2 of more than 10 mm of mercury from wakefulness with a PtCO2 greater than 50 mm of mercury for 10 minutes. This is the number 1 criterion here, where we find a prevalence of alveolar hyperventilation of 13%. The Ward's criteria is the presence of a peak PtCO2 of more than 49 mm of mercury. You can see that this criterion is much more sensitive, since 44% of patients are considered to have nocturnal hypoventilation. Simone's criteria, the average greater than 50 mm of mercury, is the criterion used in France by the National Authority for Health to establish the indication for long-term non-invasive ventilation. This criterion is much more specific, but much less sensitive. You see that only 33% of patients are considered to have nocturnal hypoventilation. Over the first 2 years of follow-up, 35 patients used non-invasive ventilation. 22 had been identified by Ward's criterion, that is with a sensitivity of 63% and a specificity of 35%. So, as I was saying, a sensitive criterion, but not very specific. 9 was identified by the American Sleep Society criterion with a sensitivity of 25%, but a good specificity of 80%. The problem is that 3 patients died of acute respiratory failure, so they had not been detected early enough, and therefore had not had recourse to NIV. The authors proposed a multi-model to assess the risk of initiation of non-invasive ventilation. They put in this model the daytime PaCO2, the vital capacity, the bicarbonates, and the capnography according to Ward's criteria, since it was the one that had identified the most patients, and then the maximum inspiratory pressure. And in fact, of these criteria, only 2 were significant. The Ward criteria with a ratio at 2,56, and the forced vital capacity, with a decrease of 10% of the forced vital capacity, with a ratio of 1,22. These thresholds were also tested on the follow-up of non-invasive ventilation with 55 neuromuscular patients. Using the Ward's threshold and the 2 thresholds of the American Society of Physiology, and then a third criterion, which is a peak greater than 55 mm of mercury. The criterion used in the monitoring of invasive ventilation with oximetry with a time spent at a pulsating oxygen saturation of less than 90% of more than 10% of the total time was also tested. See again that the prevalence diagnosed with these different thresholds varies according to the criterion, with the Ward criterion 42% of patients, the oximetry criterion 14% of patients. Finally, if we look at the prognostic values of these different criteria, in terms of the risk of being hospitalized in intensive care or the risk of dying, only 2 criteria were able to significantly predict this risk. First, the time spent at a PtCO2 greater than 49 mm of mercury, more than 10% of the total recording time, and secondly, the peak of more than 55 mm of mercury. So not the criteria of the award or the criterion of the American Society of Physiology. What about the average above 50 mm of mercury, which is used in France as an indication criteria? This endpoint was tested in respiratory insufficient patients, with 48 neuromuscular patients, 27 patients with ALS, 14 with muscular dystrophy, patients with obesity hyperventilation syndrome, and patients with kyphoscoliosis. This is the study I showed you earlier. I showed you earlier that capnography made it possible to detect 20% of patients who did not have diurnal alveolar hyperventilation. But this criterion misses 6% of patients who have true nocturnal hyperventilation, since they even have diurnal alveolar hyperventilation, but an average PtCO2 of less than 50 mm of mercury, since this criterion is very specific, but it is insufficiently sensitive. And so, If we conclude in terms of analysis, no criterion is really validated, since all these criteria that I am showing you here have only been validated in patients with neuromuscular pathologies, no data, for example, in COPD patients. So, what I suggest is to look at the time spent at a PtCO2 of more than 49 millimeters of mercury. If it is more than 10% of the total recording time, it means that there is nocturnal hypoventilation. You also have to look at the value of the peak. If it is greater than 55 millimeters of mercury, be careful, there is a prognostic value in patients who are on non-invasive ventilation. You have to look at the average value. If it is above 50 millimeters of mercury, you are sure that there is alveolar hyperventilation. There is also the time spent at a PtCO2 greater than 55. But this criteria has been validated in patients on spontaneous ventilation. It has no prognostic value in patients who are on long-term ventilation, since it is already too hard. And above all, you will have to look at the shape of the curve, because this is what will tell you the presence or not of nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation, and we will see that on the second practical part. What are the limitations of nocturnal capnography? If you remember how the capnograph works, there has to be a time for the CO2 to be transferred to the sensor. It has to interact with the electrolyte solution, and so there has to be a pH variation. And this response time takes between 50 and 90 seconds, or even longer when the sensor is positioned subclavicular, and therefore there will be no diagnosis of brief events such as obstructive apneas. You see here a recording where the saturation varies a lot with a lot of brief events that are not visible on the capnography. It can be seen after a while since there will be a progressive accumulation of CO2 due to the hypercapnic load caused by repeated apneas, so we will see a gradual increase in PtCO2, but this time due to the accumulation of CO2. The other limit is a technical limit. Here you see a study that was intended to evaluate nocturnal hypoventilation in COPD patients with polysomnography, that is done with personnel trained in capnography. And yet, there are 23 polysomnographies that had not been interpretable because of technical artifacts and mainly related to capnography. So you can see that 19% of artifacts related to capnography are there, even though there is a trained staff. And so you can imagine that at home, this technical limitation is much greater. So in conclusion, Jean-Paul Janssen in Thorax proposed to position capnography as a second line to monitor the effectiveness of non-invasive ventilation when there was no anomaly in oximetry, arterial gas, and there was no leak when nocturnal hyperventilation was suspected. The positioning of capnography, still by Jean-Paul Janssen a few years later, in 2022, has been reviewed here. It is part of the criteria for effectiveness, for evaluating the effectiveness of non-invasive ventilation in the long term. I think that this capnography must be carried out when we follow patients at home as in the hospital, since there are much fewer technical artifacts, and so you find here the criteria used by Jean-Paul Janssen's on with a peak greater than 50. Well, a peak, the value of the peak, with a threshold of 55 millimeters of mercury, and the time spent at a PtCO2 on 49 millimeters of mercury, with a threshold of 10% of the recording time. But you can see that it also appears here, so if the patient is in a hospital or in an institutionalized sector where we are sure of the technical quality, we can leave capnography as a first line. When he is at home, I think it should be offered as a second line when nocturnal hyperventilation is suspected. In conclusion, nocturnal capnography is more sensitive for diagnosing hyperventilation, and in particular nocturnal hyperventilation. This allows a dynamic study of the evolution of PCO2. The presence of nocturnal hyperventilation has a prognostic value, but it has only been shown in neuromuscular patients, and there has been an improvement in technical performance over time, and therefore it allows us to use this recording to diagnose alveolar hyperventilation, in case the daytime arterial blood gas is normal. But it doesn't allow you to diagnose brief events, such as obstructive apnea. There are a lot of technical pitfalls, especially at home, as you have seen. And so it is important to be able to recognize technical errors. And it requires training for technicians, nurses, but also doctors to be able to recognize a recording that is not technically valid. Thank you for your attention.